They terrorized each other, but this time, it went too far. The scent of pine trees and dirt greeted Michael as he unloaded Brett's pickup truck. Nature wasn't his thing. He didn't like to hike. He couldn't tell the difference between poison oak and a maple leaf. But there he was, in Mount McKinley National Forest. Lugging the gear across the dirt, he dropped it in the clearing Brett marked for them. A full turn showed him nothing but trees in every direction. Even the road they took to get there seemed to disappear in the brush. His heart fluttered and his skin tingled. Something wasn't right, but he didn't want to say anything. Brett, Tony, and Anna were out in the woods collecting kindling and digging a latrine. The only thing he had to do was set up the tents, something else he didn't like to do. And with all the items in his con list checked off, Michael huffed under his breath as he stared at the hot pink tarp with tent poles scattered around it. Anna said her tent would be the easiest, but he didn't believe that for 1 second. Rope, metal spikes, and flaps of fabric stared back at Michael while he tried his best to lay out the materials in a way that would tell him what to do. They were in a dead zone, so his phone was rendered useless. No tutorials to help him through. Frustration drenched him as he cursed every part of Anna's tent. Off in the distance, leaves rustled. Turning toward the noise, he could have sworn he saw something, but felt something watching him from the trees. He knew how this movie went, and he refused to go exploring. Instead, he trotted back to Brett's truck and locked himself inside, with his own cowardly reflection staring back at him. He couldn't stay in there. They would be back and see that Anna was right. He couldn't survive in the wild. Michael had gotten himself invited on this trip as a part of a friendly but not so friendly wager. After minutes of degrading Anna's mechanical skills when she couldn't tell a jack from a tire iron, their bickering led to this. Him out in the woods, proving that a guy who fixes cars can survive a week of camping, along with a hike up to the summit. So, he took a deep breath, chastised himself in the mirror, and got back out of the truck. His mind was playing tricks on him, and he wasn't going to let it or Anna win. After he pushed his disdain for the forest out of his head, he was able to focus and put Anna's tent together. It wasn't as easy as she made it sound, but he finished and moved on to the other two. Using her tent as his template, he was able to get them both up by the time everyone returned to the site. Tony came back first, soaking wet and dragging his muddy shovel behind him. Apparently, a quick splash in the nearby lake was necessary after he finished digging the pit. The temperature was dropping, but he didn't care as he shed his wet clothes and tossed them over the side of the truck. He was just about dressed when Anna and Brett returned, pulling a heavy sheet of canvas with way more than kindling stacked on it. The logs looked heavy. Both Brett and Anna looked exhausted. Michael looked around into the trees again, wondering what that looming feeling was. There was nothing he could do to settle his nerves. He wanted to say something, especially about the noise he had heard earlier, but it was just a noise, and they were outside. There are supposed to be noises, he told himself. So after another few deep breaths to calm himself down, he grabbed his stuff from the truck. The only thing Michael had brought was a few layers of clothes and an insulated sleeping bag. He told them that if he was going to rough it, he was going to commit to it completely. They laughed at him, warned him of bears, mountain lions, and other things that could eat him while he slept, but he simply laughed it off. Michael had every intention of sleeping by a roaring fire that would scare off any beast. Worst case scenario, he'd hop into the truck and stretch out across the back seat. But that's not what he told them. The temperatures continued to fall as they laughed and talked around the roaring campfire. Michael was somewhat enjoying himself when Tony broke out some good old-fashioned moonshine. Things got really interesting. One by one, they went around revealing what scared them the most. It was up to the next person to make up a cheesy ghost story using that person's phobia. Everything was in good fun. There were harmless tales at best, until it was Michael's turn. Trying to stump Anna, he blurted out, "Feathers." The looks on everyone's faces made him smile, right before they erupted into laughter. But Anna didn't find it funny. She decided she was going to make him pay for that absurd answer with what she thought could turn into a bone-chilling tale. Little Johnny Tulip lived on a farm with his parents. Every morning, he'd tend to his chores like any good little boy would do. With the harvest moon approaching in a few days, the animals were getting restless. The pigs were louder than normal. The horses stirred in their stalls, and the chickens clucked with a ferocity he'd never seen. Something was different, but Johnny just couldn't put his finger on it. The harvest moon was thought to have great powers. Old tales, his parents told him, warned of the powerful transformations brought on by the orb of night. So, Johnny made sure to pay close attention to what happened on the farm. As it went, the morning of the harvest moon was pretty normal, until Johnny reached the chicken coop. The chickens had stopped clucking. There was an eerie silence he didn't like, and sent goosebumps down his arms. Opening the gate to where they'd sectioned off the chicken coop, Johnny took a few steps with a big bag of feed in hand. Tossing a handful onto the ground, he expected his chickens to come out and feast. But there was nothing. The gate wasn't open. There was no sign that anything had gotten in or gotten out as Johnny crept closer to the little doorway. He wondered what he would see if he took a peek inside. The only thing little Johnny underestimated was how small the entry to the chicken coop was. With the bag of feed still in his clutches and his heart thumping against his chest, he pulled himself halfway into the coop, looking from side to side. There was nothing, not a chicken in sight. It wasn't until he tried to get out that the true problem arose. He was stuck. Something brushed against his leg, but he couldn't see what it was. Shaking his foot, he tried desperately to get whatever was near him away while he tried to wiggle free. It wouldn't let up. What started as a gentle nudging turned into something hard and sharp, clamping onto his calf. Little Johnny screamed for help as he panicked and cried. It wasn't until he heard the sound of his father's shotgun that the pain subsided and something big hit the dirt. Once Johnny released the bag of feed, he was able to free himself. only to see his father had killed the biggest chicken they ever saw. It was bigger than his 10-year-old body, and its beak was covered in his blood and that of the other chickens. No one could explain how or why, but the chicken was chopped up and fed to the pigs. Over the next few days, Johnny watched the pigs to see if they'd grow extra big too. But they didn't. The only thing that changed was the size of the bandages on his leg. The skin looked like it was bubbling over the bite, and as time passed by, it healed. There was a difference in Johnny, however, and he could feel it. By the next harvest moon, his leg started throbbing. He'd cry out in pain, but every time his parents rushed to his side, the pain would subside, and he'd smile at their attention. It was grown wearisome for them to drop everything at his beck and call. So one day, the pain shot through his leg and stopped at his back. Peeling his clothes off, Johnny's entire body was pink and red all over. His pores were large, and there were the beginnings of hairs poking through his skin. When he cried out for his parents, he told them he was growing feathers. They looked at him and laughed, telling him he was just tired. But when Johnny's parents woke the next morning, he was gone. Out of his bed. They searched the entire farm for him, only to find a trail of feathers leading to the attic. He wasn't in there, so they ran outside just in time to see Johnny standing on the pitch of the rooftop. Anna took a deep breath before she told the rest of her story in the form of a nursery rhyme. Little Johnny Tulip, who liked to lie, sprouted feathers and thought he could fly. And before you know it, he'd try to show it by jumping off the room and landing where he died. Michael wasn't sure which was funnier, his fake phobia or the horrible story Anna just told them. They all laughed it off, eventually drifting to sleep. By the time the alcohol wore off, he woke up to a chill in the air. The fire was out, his eyes strained to focus. His throat was dry, and as he reached around for his pack, there was nothing but dirt and grass around him as he pulled himself out of his sleeping bag. It wasn't until he was on his feet that he realized the tents were gone. Looking around, so was Brett's truck. He called out to them, but no one answered. He laughed at their poor attempt to pretend they ditched him, but when no one jumped out, he began to panic. Thump, thump, thump. The steady thumping of his pulse in his ears drowned out the noises of the night, and for whatever reason he couldn't fathom, Anna's story stuck with him. As stupid as it was, there was a tingling right under his skin. It bothered him as he walked around in circles, getting lost in the trees, continuously calling out to the guys. Sweat beaded around his temples. Even tears formed in his eyes. Sniffing them back, he continued to scream out until his throat went sore. There was no sign of anyone anywhere. He managed to find his way back to the campsite, but the only thing he saw was his sleeping bag. He couldn't think. He didn't know where to go. The temperature was dropping, and suddenly, his true fear snuck up on him. He was all alone. Dropping to the ground, he wrapped his arms around his knees, rocking himself back and forth, trying to get his nerves to calm down. He wanted to relax. He wanted to shift his mind off of his own paranoia of dying in the woods without anyone finding him. But his body wouldn't stop trembling, and his skin wouldn't stop itching. Shuffling around in his clothes, Michael didn't know how long he'd been sitting there when the sound of Brett's truck pulled around a bend and back into the clearing. Looking up, his eyes red and full of pain, he saw the three friends get out of the truck laughing and covered in dirt. "Where the hell were you guys?" he yelled to them, grabbing his hair, nearly pulling it out of his scalp. "Aw, what's the matter? Poor baby got a little scared?" Anna's teasing did nothing to calm him down as he berated them with every curse word he'd ever known. It wasn't until he was done that Brett walked over and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned him around to show him his sleeping bag. Inside the bag, in the pocket where the pillow would go, a piece of paper stuck out. They'd gone hiking, and only returned to see if he was awake and ready to go with them for the rest of the day. They tried waking him, but it was impossible. Michael didn't believe them, but after they calmed down, he played it off. But something was certainly different. Michael couldn't shake the looming thoughts of rage and doom circling his mind, even as he smiled at their jokes and followed them along the trail. Anna wouldn't let it go. How they found him cowering. That was her favorite word to use as she told the story over and over again. Brett and Tony chuckled right along before telling her to let up. They were all in on it, he thought to himself. With his skin still itching, he walked next to Tony while Brett and Anna headed their hike. They weren't on a marked trail, but he'd been marking trees so he could find his way back. The itching was getting worse. He joked that he was growing feathers, but they laughed it off, and Anna brought the conversation back to him being terrified of being alone. She wouldn't let it go. Michael made up his mind. He wouldn't let it go either. They got to the base of a steep cliff. Mountain climbing wasn't his thing, but he told them he'd do everything they were doing. He'd only been a few times, but this would be easy with the four of them. The ropes they used were sturdy, built for the task ahead. Brett led the charge with Tony close behind him. Anna chose to bring up the rear since Michael wasn't as experienced. They counted the minutes before each of them traversed the wall. The higher they got, the crisper the air. Michael wasn't scared of heights, but he wasn't partial to falling either. He did his best following the guys, grabbing little niches in the rock, trying to keep himself steady. Pieces would crumble and fall, and Anna shouted for him to be careful. She threw in one last jab about his fear of loneliness, and that was all he could take. The next rock Michael gripped was loose enough to pry away from the wall. He broke it off, brushing himself away, and slammed the rock down with all of his might, knocking Anna out cold. Brett and Tony looked down to see what the lagging in the rope was for. "What happened?" Brett called out. "Anna! I'm sorry, one of the rocks, it broke off. She hit her head," Michael called up, The three guys made it to the top of the mountainous wall and dragged Anna's body up. Her scalp was split open. Blood was dripping down her face and pooling around the wound. Michael's heart raced. He couldn't believe what happened. A smile crept between his cheeks as the silence of Anna's endless taunting settled on him. "We need to get help," Tony said. "She'll be fine." Michael sighed to himself. Brett pushed Michael. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? Look at her. What did you do?" Michael put his hands up as Brett grabbed him by his jacket, shaking him violently as Anna continued to bleed out on the top of the ridge. They tussled around, and before Tony could stop them, Michael tossed Brett over the edge. Tony screamed to Michael, but before he could finish, the rope snatched him off the ledge too. Time didn't let Michael ponder the consequences of his actions, as one by one, the four of them went over the edge. Plummeting down to the ground below, Michael's life flashed before his eyes, and his skin never stopped itching. By the time their bodies were found, they were fairly stiff. The medical examiner took his time going over every inch so he could give their families closure. But it would never be enough until they found Brett's truck. Inside the truck, they found a camera with a video of the night they all died. Brett and Anna can be heard laughing as they zoomed in on Michael stumbling and crying out in fear through the woods. There was even footage of Anna gluing feathers to his arms while he slept. The feathers never stuck, but the glue made him scratch into the flesh of his skin. It was only when Tony grabbed the camera, telling them they'd gone too far, that the footage ended. While many believe the death of the four friends was an accident, there were those who knew better. Those who knew that it was something a little more sinister between them. Harmless pranks turned into a lethal game that none of them won. And so, their spirits remained where their bodies were found. It appeared that Michael lost his bet. He couldn't survive in the woods. He couldn't hike up to the summit. But he did conquer his fears. He never died alone. His body was found, and a spirit would forever haunt that place, dragging the 3 other souls he'd stolen behind him. They say you could still hear the soft voice of Anna singing as her body lays limp, attached to a ghostly rope. Little boy Mike didn't like to hike, but he would lie and say he did. When teasing bruised his ego, he let out a sigh that was so evil and tossed us all off a cliff.